At first, it felt like you were being watched. Then came the massive prints on the ground and the faint metallic smell in the air. The sound of snapping branches behind you was no longer distant. It was coming straight toward you. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's stories, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to stay updated with future stories. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the first attack. John Harper took a deep breath as he stepped out of his weathered Subaru Outback, the crisp mountain air filling his lungs. At 65, he was no stranger to hiking, but there was something special about Glacier National Park that always made his heart race with excitement. He glanced at his watch, 7:30 a.m. Perfect timing for an early start. Another beautiful day in paradise, John murmured to himself, stretching his arms above his head. The parking lot was nearly empty, just the way he liked it. He'd been coming to this particular trailhead for years, but today felt different somehow. Maybe it was the extra spring in his step since his retirement last month, or perhaps it was the unseasonably warm weather for late September. John opened the trunk and pulled out his trusty backpack, the familiar weight of his gear a comforting presence. He mentally checked off his essentials: water, trail mix, first aid kit, map, compass, and, most importantly, bear spray. Living in Montana had taught him never to underestimate the importance of being prepared. As he adjusted the straps of his pack, a park ranger's truck pulled into the lot. John raised a hand in greeting as a young woman in uniform stepped out. "Morning, sir. Heading out for a hike?" she called, her voice cheery despite the early hour. John nodded, smiling. "Sure am. Thought I'd take advantage of this beautiful weather while it lasts." The ranger approached, her expression turning serious. "Well, just want to give you a heads up. We've had a few bear sightings in the area recently. Nothing aggressive, but it's always good to be aware." "Appreciate the warning," John replied, patting the bear spray canister on his belt. "I've had my fair share of encounters over the years. Never can be too careful." The ranger nodded approvingly. "Glad to see you're prepared. Enjoy your hike and remember to make some noise on the trail. Don't want to startle any furry friends." With a final wave, John set off towards the trailhead. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he passed the information board, pausing briefly to double-check the trail map. He'd hiked this route dozens of times, but it never hurt to refresh his memory. The narrow trail wound its way into the dense forest, towering pines creating a cathedral-like canopy overhead. John breathed deeply, savoring the scent of earth and evergreens. This was why he hiked, to immerse himself in the raw beauty of nature, to feel small in the face of wilderness. As he walked, John's mind wandered to the bear sightings the ranger had mentioned. He'd seen plenty of bears in his time, mostly from a safe distance. There was that one close call a few years back when a mother and cubs had crossed his path, but he'd managed to back away slowly without incident. Still, a tendril of unease curled in his stomach. "Get a grip, old man," John muttered to himself, shaking his head. "You're more likely to trip over your own feet than run into a bear." He continued along the trail, occasionally calling out, "Hey, bear," as he rounded blind corners. The sound of his voice echoed through the trees, quickly swallowed by the vastness of the forest. After about an hour of steady hiking, the rush of water reached his ears, growing louder with each step. John emerged from a particularly dense patch of trees to find himself at the edge of a crystal-clear stream. The water tumbled over smooth rocks, creating a soothing symphony of nature. It was the perfect spot for a quick break. "Now this is what I call a view," John said aloud, grinning as he carefully made his way to a large, flat boulder at the water's edge. He shrugged off his backpack and eased himself down, wincing slightly as his joints protested the movement. "Guess I'm not as spry as I used to be," he chuckled. John pulled out his water bottle and took a long swig, then fished a granola bar from his pack. As he munched, he gazed out at the scene before him. Sunlight danced on the surface of the stream, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. It was moments like these that made all the aches and pains of hiking worthwhile. Suddenly, a twig snapped somewhere in the forest behind him. John froze mid-bite, his senses instantly on high alert. He slowly turned his head, scanning the dense foliage for any sign of movement. The forest had gone eerily quiet, the only sound the steady rush of the stream. "Hello?" John called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Anyone there?" No response came, but John couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. A shiver ran down his spine despite the warm sunlight. He'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know when something felt off. "All right, John," he muttered to himself, slowly getting to his feet. "Time to move on. No sense in overstaying your welcome." With deliberate movements, John repacked his bag and hoisted it onto his shoulders. He took one last look around the clearing, seeing nothing out of the ordinary, but the sense of unease lingered. As he continued along the trail, John found himself hyper-aware of his surroundings. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made him tense. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself he was being paranoid, but his instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. "You're just letting that ranger's warning get to you," John said aloud, hoping the sound of his voice would calm his nerves. Been hiking these trails for years without incident. No reason today should be any different. But even as he spoke the words, John knew he was trying to convince himself. He'd learned long ago to trust his gut in the wilderness, and right now his gut was telling him to be on guard. The trail began to narrow as it wound around the side of a steep hill. On one side, the ground dropped away sharply, offering breathtaking views of the valley below. On the other, a rocky slope rose up, dotted with scraggly bushes and the occasional stunted tree. John was so focused on carefully placing his feet on the narrow path that he almost missed it. A movement in his peripheral vision made him turn his head sharply to the left. There, not 20 feet away on the slope above him, stood a massive black bear. Time seemed to stand still as John's eyes met those of the bear. It was larger than any he'd seen before, its black fur gleaming in the dappled sunlight. For a moment, neither moved, sizing each other up in a silent standoff. John's mind raced, years of wilderness safety training kicking in. "Stay calm," he whispered to himself, his hand slowly moving towards the bear spray on his belt. "Don't run. Don't turn your back." The bear huffed, a deep, guttural sound that John felt in his bones. It took a step forward, powerful muscles rippling beneath its fur. "Hey, bear," John called out, trying to keep his voice steady and authoritative. "I see you there. I don't want any trouble. I'm just passing through." The bear tilted its head, as if considering John's words. For a fleeting moment, John thought it might turn and leave. Then, with a roar that shattered the silence of the forest, the bear charged. Time seemed to slow as the bear charged, its powerful legs eating up the distance between them in mere seconds. John's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline flooding his system as his fight-or-flight response kicked into overdrive. Oh God," John muttered, his fingers trembling as he fumbled for the bear spray on his belt. The safety cap seemed impossibly small, his usually dexterous hands clumsy with fear. Come on. The thundering footfalls of the bear grew louder, drowning out everything else. John could smell its musky odor, hear its heavy breathing. He knew he had only one chance to get this right. Finally, his fingers closed around the bear spray canister. With a desperate yank, he pulled it free from its holster. The safety cap popped off, clattering to the ground unnoticed. John whirled to face the oncoming bear, his arm outstretched, finger on the trigger of the spray. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But it was too late. The bear's hot breath hit John's face as it reared up on its hind legs, towering over him like a furry mountain of muscle and claws. In that moment, John felt impossibly small, a fragile human facing the raw power of nature. "Please," John whispered, a final, futile plea. The bear's paw connected with John's side, a searing pain exploding through his body. The force of the blow lifted him off his feet, sending him flying off the narrow trail. The bear spray fell from his grasp, arcing uselessly through the air. Time seemed to speed up again as John tumbled down the rocky slope. The world spun around him, a kaleidoscope of sky, trees, and earth. Sharp rocks tore at his clothes and skin, each impact sending fresh waves of pain through his body. "Help!" John cried out, though he knew there was no one to hear him. His voice was lost in the cacophony of his own body striking the unforgiving ground. After what felt like an eternity, John came to a bone-jarring stop against a fallen tree. The impact drove the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping and disoriented. For a moment, John lay there, struggling to breathe, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The pain hadn't fully registered yet, shock keeping it at bay for the moment. Slowly, carefully, John tried to move. A groan escaped his lips as his battered body protested. "Okay, John," he muttered to himself. "Take stock. You're alive, that's step one." He blinked, trying to clear his vision. Blood trickled into his eyes, and he raised a shaking hand to his forehead, feeling a deep gash there. His fingers came away red and sticky. "That's not good," John said, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears. He tried to sit up, but a sharp stabbing pain in his side stopped him short. John gasped, tears springing to his eyes. Gingerly, he felt along his rib cage, wincing as his fingers found a spot that gave slightly under pressure. "Broken rib," he diagnosed grimly. "Maybe more than one." John closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of the bear. Had it followed him down the slope? Was it still nearby, waiting to finish what it had started? The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No bird song, no rustling leaves. Just the sound of John's own ragged breathing. "Hello?" he called out weakly, immediately regretting it as pain lanced through his side. "Is anyone there?" Only silence answered him. With trembling hands, John reached for his backpack, which had somehow stayed with him during the fall. He needed to call for help. His fingers fumbled with the zipper, finally managing to open the main compartment. "Come on, where are you?" he muttered, digging through the contents. His hand closed around his phone, and for a moment hope flared in his chest. That hope was quickly extinguished as he pulled out the device. The screen was a spider web of cracks, the casing bent and warped from the impact of the fall. "No, no, no," John said, pressing the power button desperately. The screen remained dark. "Come on, you can't do this to me." But the phone was well and truly dead, leaving John cut off from any hope of immediate rescue. As the adrenaline began to fade, the full extent of his injuries became apparent. Every breath sent sharp pains through his chest. His head throbbed, and he could feel warm blood still trickling down his face. Cuts and bruises covered his body, each making itself known with stinging intensity. John leaned back against the fallen tree, closing his eyes as a wave of dizziness washed over him. He was trapped on this mountainside, alone and hurt with no way to call for help. "Think, John," he said to himself, trying to keep panic at bay. "You've been in tough spots before. You can get through this." But as he sat there, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was injured, possibly seriously. He had no way to contact anyone. And somewhere out there, a potentially aggressive bear was roaming the area. John opened his eyes, scanning the forest around him. From his new vantage point at the bottom of the slope, the trees seemed to loom over him, their shadows deep and threatening. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made him flinch, expecting to see the bear's massive form emerging from the undergrowth. "Okay," John said, his voice shaky but determined. "First things first, you need to stop this bleeding." With careful movements, John shrugged off what remained of his tattered jacket. He tore a strip from the least damaged part, folding it into a makeshift bandage. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he pressed it firmly against the gash on his forehead. "That'll have to do for now," he muttered, tying the fabric in place as best he could with one hand. Next, John turned his attention to his broken rib. There wasn't much he could do about it out here, but he knew he needed to stabilize it somehow to prevent further damage. Using another strip of his ruined jacket, he created a makeshift binding around his chest, pulling it tight enough to offer some support. The process was slow and painful, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through his body. By the time he finished, John was drenched in sweat, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Now what?" he asked aloud, his voice sounding small and lost in the vastness of the forest. John knew he couldn't stay where he was. He was too exposed, too vulnerable. He needed to find shelter, to get to a place where he could defend himself if the bear returned. but moving seemed an impossible task. Every slight shift of his body sent pain radiating through him. The thought of trying to climb back up the slope he had tumbled down was daunting, to say the least. A sound in the distance made John freeze. Was that a growl? Or just the wind playing tricks on his frayed nerves? "Get up," John told himself firmly. "You can't stay here, you have to move." Using the fallen tree for support, John slowly, painfully pulled himself to his feet. The world swam around him, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out. But he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay conscious. "One step at a time," he muttered, taking a tentative step forward. "You can do this, John. You have to do this." As John took his first shaky steps away from the site of his fall, he cast one last glance back up the slope. Somewhere up there was the trail, his ticket back to safety. But between him and that trail was a treacherous climb, unknown dangers, and possibly an angry bear. With a deep, painful breath, John turned away and started moving deeper into the forest. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay still. Survival now depended on keeping moving, finding help, and above all, avoiding another encounter with the bear. As the shadows lengthened around him, John Harper, retired hiker and unexpected survivor, began his desperate journey through the wilderness, each step a battle against pain, fear, and the encroaching darkness. Blood trickled into John's eyes as he stumbled through the underbrush, his vision blurring with each painful step. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his sight, but the metallic taste in his mouth served as a grim reminder of the bear's brutal attack. "Focus, John," he muttered to himself, his voice raspy and weak, one foot in front of the other. Every breath was agony as John tried to assess the damage to his body. His fingers probed the deep gash on his forehead, wincing as they came away sticky with fresh blood. The makeshift bandage he'd fashioned earlier was already soaked through, doing little to stem the flow. As he moved, a sharp pain in his side made him gasp and double over. "Definitely a broken rib," John wheezed, gingerly touching his side. The area was swollen and tender, and he could feel the unmistakable give of bone where there shouldn't be any movement. John leaned against a nearby tree, trying to catch his breath. The forest around him seemed to spin, and he closed his eyes, fighting against a wave of nausea. When he opened them again, he strained his ears for any sign of the bear, terrified that it might return to finish what it started. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire woodland held its breath, waiting. "Hello?" John called out weakly, immediately regretting the action as pain lanced through his chest. "Is anyone there?" Only the echo of his own voice answered him, bouncing off trees and fading into the distance. John felt a crushing wave of loneliness wash over him. He was truly alone out here, injured and lost. With shaking hands, John reached for his phone once more, a desperate hope fluttering in his chest. Maybe he'd been wrong earlier. Maybe it wasn't completely destroyed. But as he pulled the device from his pocket, that hope was quickly extinguished. The screen was a spider web of cracks, the casing bent and warped. John pressed the power button, holding it down for several seconds, but the phone remained stubbornly dark. "Come on, you piece of junk," John muttered, pressing the button again and again. "Just give me 1 bar. 1 second of life. That's all I need." But the phone was well and truly dead, leaving John cut off from any hope of immediate rescue. He let out a frustrated groan, fighting the urge to throw the useless device into the underbrush. "Okay, think," John said aloud, trying to keep his voice steady. What would the park rangers say to do in this situation? He closed his eyes, recalling the wilderness safety seminars he'd attended over the years. "Stay put," they always said. "Make yourself visible. Wait for rescue." But as John looked around at the unfamiliar terrain, he realized with growing dread that staying put wasn't an option. He had no idea how far he'd tumbled down the slope or in which direction the trail lay. He was well and truly lost, and as the adrenaline from the attack began to fade, the full extent of his injuries became apparent. Every movement sent waves of pain through his battered body. His head throbbed mercilessly, and he could feel warm blood still trickling down his face despite his best efforts to staunch the flow. John took stock of his supplies. His backpack had miraculously stayed with him during the fall, but much of its contents had spilled out. He still had some water, a few energy bars, and his first aid kit. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. With trembling fingers, John opened the first aid kit and pulled out an antiseptic wipe. He gritted his teeth as he cleaned the gash on his forehead, the sting of the antiseptic adding to his misery. He then applied a proper bandage, securing it as best he could with one hand. "That'll have to do for now," he muttered, packing away the remaining supplies. John knew he needed to move. Staying in one place made him an easy target if the bear decided to return. But which way should he go? Every direction looked the same, an endless sea of trees and underbrush. He closed his eyes, trying to orient himself. The trail had been running north to south, and he'd fallen down the eastern slope. If he could make his way west, he might be able to intersect the trail again. "West it is," John said, opening his eyes and squinting at the sun's position. "Or at least, what I hope is west." With a grunt of pain, John pushed himself away from the tree and took a tentative step. His legs shook with the effort, threatening to give out beneath him, but he pressed on, each step a small victory against the pain and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. As John made his slow, painful progress through the forest, the light began to fade. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him with grasping fingers. The sound of a snapping branch nearby sent John into a panic. He whirled around, eyes darting wildly as he searched for any sign of the bear's return. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat sending fresh waves of pain through his broken rib. "It's nothing," John whispered to himself, trying to calm his frayed nerves. Probably just a squirrel or something. But as the shadows deepened and the forest took on a more sinister quality, John found it harder and harder to convince himself. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound, a harbinger of danger. John forced himself to keep moving even as his body screamed for rest. He knew that stopping now as night approached could be a death sentence. He needed to find some kind of shelter, somewhere he could defend himself if the bear returned. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, John spotted a large fallen tree ahead. Its massive trunk had created a small hollow as it fell, offering a semblance of shelter. With the last of his strength, John made his way to the fallen giant. He crawled into the hollow, his body protesting every movement. But as he settled into the relative safety of his makeshift shelter, a small measure of relief washed over him. "Made it," John mumbled, his voice thick with exhaustion. "Just need to rest for a bit. Just a little while." As the forest plunged into darkness around him, John Harper huddled in his shelter, every sense on high alert. The night stretched before him, long and full of unknown dangers. But he had survived the bear's attack, had made it this far. Now all he could do was wait for dawn and pray that rescue would come. The pain in his side had settled into a constant, throbbing ache. John tried to shift into a more comfortable position, but every movement sent fresh spikes of agony through his body. He closed his eyes, focusing on his breathing, trying to find some calm in the midst of his dire situation. In the distance, an owl hooted, the sound eerily human-like in the still night air. John's eyes snapped open, his heart racing. For a moment, he thought he saw a pair of glowing eyes watching him from the darkness. But when he blinked, they were gone. "It's not real," John told himself firmly. "You're letting your imagination run wild. Get a grip." But as the long hours of the night stretched endlessly before him, John found it increasingly difficult to distinguish between reality and the terrifying products of his fear-addled mind. Every rustle in the underbrush became the sound of approaching danger. Every shadow held the potential for harm. John jerked awake repeatedly, unaware he had even dozed off. Each time, panic gripped him as he momentarily forgot where he was, the events of the day rushing back in a terrifying flood. As the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, John realized with a mix of relief and dread that he had survived the night. But his ordeal was far from over. Stiff, sore, and still very much in danger, John Harper prepared himself for another day of survival in the unforgiving wilderness. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, John Harper stirred in his makeshift shelter. Each movement sent waves of pain through his battered body, a stark reminder of yesterday's terrifying encounter. He blinked away the remnants of a fitful sleep, his mind slowly coming to terms with his dire situation. "Another day in paradise," John muttered sarcastically, his voice hoarse and weak. Gingerly, he pulled himself into a sitting position, using the fallen tree for support. His muscles screamed in protest, stiff from the cold night and the previous day's ordeal. The gash on his forehead had stopped bleeding, but the area felt tight and painful. His broken rib sent sharp stabs of agony through his side with every breath. John closed his eyes, taking a moment to gather his strength. "All right, old man," he said to himself. "Time to get moving. You can't stay here forever." With a grunt of effort, John dragged himself upright, using the fallen tree for support. The world spun around him, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. But he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay conscious. "One step at a time," John wheezed, taking a tentative step forward. "You can do this. You have to do this." Each movement sent waves of pain through his battered body, but John forced himself to keep going. He knew that staying put meant certain death. If the bear didn't find him, exposure or his injuries would finish the job. As he stumbled through the underbrush, John tried to orient himself. The rising sun was to his right, which meant he was heading north, or was it south? In his pain-addled state, he couldn't be sure. "Some experienced hiker you are," John chastised himself. "Can't even figure out which way is north." He paused, leaning against a tree to catch his breath. The forest around him seemed alien and threatening in the early morning light. Shadows danced between the trees, and every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through him. John reached for his water bottle, his throat parched. As he tilted it back, only a few drops trickled out. His heart sank as he realized he was almost out of water. "Great," he muttered, as if things weren't bad enough already. He knew he needed to find water soon. Dehydration would only compound his already serious injuries. But the thought of leaving the relative safety of the trees to search for a stream or river filled him with dread. What if the bear was out there, waiting? A snapping twig nearby sent John into a panic. He whirled around, eyes darting wildly as he searched for any sign of the bear's return. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat sending fresh waves of pain through his broken rib. "Hello?" John called out weakly, immediately regretting the action as pain lanced through his chest. "Is anyone there?" Only silence answered him. John let out a shaky breath, trying to calm his frayed nerves. "It's nothing," he whispered to himself. "Probably just a squirrel or something." But as he continued his slow, painful progress through the forest, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of danger. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat beating down through the canopy. Sweat beaded on John's forehead, stinging as it ran into his eyes. He paused again, his legs trembling with exhaustion. "Come on, John," he urged himself. "You've got to keep moving. Think about Sarah and the kids. They're waiting for you." The thought of his family gave John a much-needed boost of determination. He pictured his wife's face, worried but strong. He imagined his children waiting anxiously for news of their father. He couldn't give up. He had to make it back to them. With renewed resolve, John pushed on. He forced himself to take a step, then another, fighting against the pain and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. Each movement was a battle, but he refused to give in. As the day wore on, the forest took on a sinister quality. The friendly woods he had enjoyed hiking through countless times now seemed to be actively working against him. Roots reached up to trip him, branches whipped at his face, and the uneven ground threatened to send him tumbling with every step. John's progress was agonizingly slow. What would have been an easy hike under normal circumstances had become a grueling test of endurance. Every few steps, he had to stop and lean against a tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Just a little further," John panted, though he had no idea where he was going. He was operating on pure instinct now, driven by the primal need to survive. As the afternoon wore on, John's condition deteriorated. The pain in his side had intensified, and he was finding it increasingly difficult to breathe. His head throbbed mercilessly, and the world seemed to tilt and spin around him. "Got to keep going," John mumbled, his words slurring together. He stumbled forward, his feet dragging on the forest floor. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. John let out a startled cry as he found himself sliding down a steep embankment. He tumbled head over heels, unable to stop his descent. Rocks and branches tore at his clothes and skin, adding fresh injuries to his already battered body. With a bone-jarring thud, John came to a stop at the bottom of the slope. He lay there, dazed and disoriented, the world spinning around him. For a moment, he thought he heard the sound of running water, but he couldn't be sure if it was real or just his imagination. "Get up," John groaned, trying to push himself upright. But his body refused to cooperate. The last of his strength had been sapped by the fall. As he lay there, helpless and alone, John felt a crushing wave of despair wash over him. He had fought so hard, had come so far, but it seemed like it was all for nothing. The forest had won. "I'm sorry, Sarah," John whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "I tried. I really tried." The light began to fade as evening approached, casting long shadows across the forest floor. John shivered, the temperature dropping rapidly as night drew near. He knew he needed to find shelter, to protect himself from the cold and any predators that might be prowling in the darkness. But moving seemed an impossible task. Every part of his body ached, and a bone-deep weariness had settled into his very core. John closed his eyes, fighting against the urge to just give up and let the forest take him. "No," he said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been all day. "I'm not done yet. I'm not giving up." With a monumental effort, John rolled onto his side. Pain exploded through his body, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through it. Slowly, agonizingly, he dragged himself towards a nearby cluster of rocks. It felt like hours, but finally, John reached the relative safety of the rock formation. He wedged himself into a small crevice, sheltered on three sides by solid stone. As the last light faded from the sky, John huddled in his meager shelter, every sense on high alert. The night stretched before him, long and full of unknown dangers, but he had survived another day. He had faced the bear, endured the fall, and pushed through pain that would have stopped most men in their tracks. "One more night," John whispered to himself as darkness fell. "Just get through one more night." And as the sounds of the nocturnal forest came alive around him, John Harper settled in for another long vigil, clinging to hope with the same tenacity that had kept him alive thus far. Darkness fell like a suffocating blanket over the forest, amplifying every rustle and snap in John Harper's vicinity. The relative safety of daylight had vanished, replaced by an oppressive blackness that seemed to press in from all sides. John huddled deeper into the crevice between the rocks, his body trembling from both cold and fear. "Just another camping trip, right, John?" he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. "Except this time, you forgot the tent, the sleeping bag, and oh yeah, you're half dead." The gallows humor did little to lift his spirits, but it was better than giving in to the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. John closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, but every sound made them snap open again, searching the darkness for threats. A twig snapped nearby, and John's heart leapt into his throat. "Hello?" he called out weakly, immediately regretting breaking the silence. What if the bear was out there listening? Only the whisper of wind through the trees answered him. John let out a shaky breath, trying to calm his racing heart. "Get a grip," he told himself firmly. "It's probably just a squirrel or something." But as the night wore on, John found it increasingly difficult to distinguish between real sounds and those conjured by his fear-addled mind. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the underbrush became the sound of approaching danger. The temperature continued to drop, and John shivered uncontrollably. His clothes, still damp from sweat and his tumble down the embankment, clung to his skin, leaching away what little body heat he had left. He hugged himself tightly, wincing as the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his broken rib. "Come on, John," he whispered through chattering teeth. "You've been through worse than this. Remember that winter camping trip in Yellowstone?" But even as he tried to reassure himself, John knew this was different. He was injured, alone, and completely unprepared for a night in the wilderness. Shock was setting in, making his thoughts fuzzy and his limbs feel heavy and unresponsive. In the distance, a wolf howled, the sound echoing through the trees. John jerked fully awake, his eyes wide with fear. "It's far away," he told himself. "They're not interested in you. Just stay quiet and still." But the howl was joined by another, then another. The pack was on the move, and John had no way of knowing which direction they were heading. He pressed himself further into the crevice, wishing he could somehow melt into the rock itself. As the night wore on, John drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time he jerked awake, momentary panic gripped him as he forgot where he was, the events of the past day rushing back in a terrifying flood. "Sarah?" he called out once, still half asleep. "Sarah, where are you?" But there was no answer, and as full consciousness returned, John felt a crushing wave of loneliness wash over him. He was truly alone out here, injured and lost, with no guarantee that anyone was even looking for him yet. In his more lucid moments, John tried to plan his next move. He knew he needed to find water soon. Dehydration would only compound his already serious injuries. But the thought of leaving the relative safety of his rocky shelter filled him with dread. "First light," he decided. "As soon as it's bright enough to see, I'll move. Got to find water. Got to keep going." A rustling in the nearby bushes made John freeze. He held his breath, straining his ears. The sound came again, closer this time. Something was out there, moving through the underbrush. John's hand instinctively went to his belt, searching for the bear spray that was no longer there. He felt naked, defenseless against whatever was approaching. The rustling stopped just outside John's field of vision. He could hear heavy breathing, the soft pad of feet on the forest floor. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure whatever it was must be able to hear it. "Go away," John whispered, his voice trembling. "Please, just go away." For what felt like an eternity, John sat perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The presence outside remained, unseen but felt, a weight in the darkness. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The forest fell silent once more, leaving John alone with his racing thoughts and hammering heart. "It's gone," he said aloud, needing to hear his own voice. "You're okay. It's gone." But the encounter left John shaken. Sleep, which had been elusive before, now seemed impossible. Every sound, every shadow became a potential threat. He sat rigidly in his shelter, eyes wide and searching the darkness, jumping at every rustle and snap. The long hours of the night stretched endlessly, each minute an eternity of fear and pain. John's injuries, which the adrenaline and movement of the day had somewhat masked, now made themselves fully known. His broken rib sent sharp stabs of agony through his side with every breath. The gash on his forehead throbbed in time with his pulse, and every part of his body ached from the fall and his desperate trek through the forest. As the night wore on, John found himself slipping into a state of half-consciousness. Reality began to blur with fevered dreams. He saw Sarah standing just beyond the reach of his shelter, calling out to him. He tried to respond, to move towards her, but his body wouldn't cooperate. "Sarah," he mumbled, reaching out a hand. "Sarah, I'm here." But when he blinked, she was gone, leaving him alone in the darkness once more. Time lost all meaning as John drifted between wakefulness and fevered dreams. He relived the bear attack over and over, each time hoping for a different outcome. He saw his children growing up without him, Sarah moving on with her life. The visions tormented him, driving home the desperate nature of his situation. "Got to make it," John muttered, his voice weak and slurred. "Got to get back to them." As the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, John stirred from his fitful half-sleep. He blinked, disoriented, as the world slowly came into focus around him. For a moment, hope flared in his chest. He had survived the night. Against all odds, he had made it through the long, terrifying hours of darkness. But as John tried to move, that hope was quickly tempered by the reality of his situation. His body was stiff and unresponsive, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through him. The night had sapped what little strength he had left, leaving him weak and disoriented. "Come on, John," he groaned, forcing himself to sit up straighter. "You made it through the night, that's step one. Now you've got to keep going." As the forest around him gradually lightened, revealing the familiar shapes of trees and rocks. John realized with a mix of relief and dread that he had survived the night, but his ordeal was far from over. He was still lost, still injured, and now weakened further by a night exposed to the elements. But he was alive, and as long as he was breathing, John Harper knew he had to keep fighting. With the new day came new challenges, but also new hope. Somewhere out there was safety, was home, and John was determined to find it no matter what it took. Slowly, painfully, he began to prepare himself for another day of survival in the unforgiving wilderness. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, John Harper forced his battered body into motion. Every muscle screamed in protest, and his broken rib sent sharp stabs of pain through his side with each breath. But John knew that staying put meant certain death. "All right, old man," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from thirst. "Time to get moving. You can't stay here forever." Using the rocks for support, John slowly pulled himself to his feet. The world spun around him, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. But he gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay conscious. "One step at a time," John wheezed, taking a tentative step forward. "You can do this. You have to do this." The thought of seeing his family again drove John forward. Each step was a battle against pain and fatigue, but he refused to give up. He pictured Sarah's face, worried but strong, and imagined his children waiting anxiously for news of their father. "Just a little further," John panted, though he had no idea where he was going. Got to find water, got to keep moving. As he stumbled through the underbrush, John tried to orient himself. The rising sun was to his right, which meant he was heading north, or was it south? In his pain-addled state, he couldn't be sure. "Some experienced hiker you are," John chastised himself. "Can't even figure out which way is north." He paused, leaning against a tree to catch his breath. The forest around him seemed alien and threatening in the morning light. Shadows danced between the trees, and every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through him. John's progress was agonizingly slow. What would have been an easy hike under normal circumstances had become a grueling test of endurance. Every few steps he had to stop and lean against a tree, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As the day wore on, John's condition deteriorated. The pain in his side had intensified, and he was finding it increasingly difficult to breathe. His head throbbed mercilessly, and the world seemed to tilt and spin around him. "Got to keep going," John mumbled, his words slurring together. He stumbled forward, his feet dragging on the forest floor. Suddenly, a distant sound caught John's attention. He froze, straining his ears. Was that a voice? "Hello?" John called out weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "Hello, is anyone there?" For a moment there was only silence. John's heart sank. Had he imagined it? Was his mind playing tricks on him? But then faintly he heard it again. A shout, carried on the wind. A surge of hope coursed through John, giving him a burst of energy he didn't know he had left. "Here," he yelled, his voice cracking with the effort. "I'm over here." John forced himself to move towards the sound, pushing through the underbrush with renewed determination. "Keep shouting," he called out. "I can hear you." The voice grew louder, more distinct. John could make out words now. "Park Service, can you hear me?" "Yes," John shouted back, tears of relief streaming down his face. "Yes, I can hear you. I'm here." John stumbled into a small clearing, his legs finally giving out beneath him. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, but he kept calling out, determined to guide his rescuers to him. And then, like a miracle, a figure emerged from the trees on the other side of the clearing. A park ranger dressed in the familiar green uniform stepped into view. "Oh, thank God," John sobbed, all his fear and pain and exhaustion finally overwhelming him. The ranger rushed to John's side, kneeling beside him. "Sir, are you John Harper?" she asked urgently. John nodded, unable to speak through his tears. "We've been looking for you since yesterday evening," the ranger explained, her voice calm and reassuring. She spoke into her radio, calling for medical assistance. "Your wife reported you missing when you didn't return from your hike. Can you tell me what happened?" Through gasping breaths, John recounted his encounter with the bear, his fall down the slope, and his desperate struggle to survive. The ranger listened attentively, her face growing grave as she realized the extent of John's ordeal. "You're incredibly lucky, Mr. Harper," she said, checking his vital signs. "And tough as nails, I might add. Not many people could have survived what you've been through." More rangers arrived, along with paramedics. They carefully loaded John onto a stretcher, mindful of his injuries. As they began to carry him out of the forest, John felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. He was safe. He was going home. But as the stretcher was carefully maneuvered through the trees, John caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. There, just visible through the undergrowth, was a flash of dark fur. A massive black shape moved silently through the forest, watching the rescue party with curious eyes. "Bear," John gasped, pointing weakly. "There's a bear." The rangers turned, hands moving to their bear spray. But by the time they looked, the animal had vanished, melting into the forest as silently as it had appeared. "It's gone now, Mr. Harper," one of the rangers assured him. "You're safe. We're getting you out of here." As John was loaded into a waiting ambulance, he couldn't shake the image of those dark, intelligent eyes watching him from the forest. Had it been the same bear that attacked him? Had it been following him all this time? The doors of the ambulance closed, and John felt the vehicle begin to move. The forest fell away behind them, and with it the lingering fear that had been John's constant companion for the past 2 days. As the paramedics worked around him, checking his vitals and tending to his injuries, John finally allowed himself to relax. He closed his eyes, exhaustion overtaking him at last. "You're going to be okay, Mr. Harper," he heard one of the paramedics say. "You're on your way to the hospital now. Your family is waiting for you." A small smile touched John's lips as he drifted off to sleep. He had done it. Against all odds, he had survived, and now, finally, he was going home. But even as relief washed over him, a part of John knew that the forest and the bear would always be with him. The memory of those dark eyes watching from the shadows would stay with him long after his physical wounds had healed. As the ambulance sped towards the hospital, John Harper left the wilderness behind. But the wilderness, it seemed, wasn't quite done with him yet. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room were a stark contrast to the dim forest light John had become accustomed to over the past 2 days. He blinked slowly, his eyes struggling to adjust as he lay in the sterile white bed, surrounded by the steady beeping of machines monitoring his vital signs. "John? Honey, can you hear me?" Sarah's voice, soft and filled with concern, cut through the fog in his mind. John turned his head slightly, wincing at the movement. "Sarah," he croaked, his throat dry and scratchy. "You're here." Sarah's face came into focus, her eyes red-rimmed from crying but filled with relief. She gently took his hand, careful not to disturb the IV line. "Of course I'm here. You gave us quite a scare, you know." John attempted a weak smile. "Sorry about that. Guess the bear didn't get the memo about my hiking schedule." Sarah let out a choked laugh, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "Oh, John. Only you could joke at a time like this." A knock at the door interrupted their reunion. A man in a police uniform entered, followed by a park ranger John recognized from his rescue. "Mr. Harper," the police officer said, approaching the bed. "I'm Officer Thompson. I hope you're feeling up to answering a few questions about what happened out there." John nodded slowly. "I'll do my best," he replied, his voice still weak. For the next hour, John recounted his harrowing experience to the increasingly skeptical-looking officials. He described the initial bear encounter, his fall down the slope, and his desperate struggle to survive in the wilderness. "And you're certain it was a black bear?" the park ranger asked, her brow furrowed. John nodded emphatically. "Absolutely. I've seen plenty of bears in my time. But this one, it was massive. And those eyes," he shuddered at the memory. Officer Thompson exchanged a glance with the ranger. "Mr. Harper, we've searched the area where you were found extensively. We haven't found any signs of recent bear activity." "What?" John said, confusion and frustration creeping into his voice. "But I saw it. It attacked me." "Your injuries are consistent with a fall," the officer continued, his tone gentle but skeptical. "And given the state you were in when you were found, it's possible that your memory of events might be unclear." John felt a surge of anger. I know what happened to me, he insisted, wincing as he tried to sit up straighter. I didn't imagine it. Sarah placed a calming hand on his arm. John, honey, please, you need to rest. The park ranger stepped forward, her expression sympathetic. Mr. Harper, we're not saying you're lying, but bear attacks are extremely rare in that area, and we haven't had any reported sightings of aggressive bears recently. John slumped back against his pillows, suddenly feeling very tired. So what are you saying? That I made it all up? Not at all, Officer Thompson said quickly. We just need to be thorough in our investigation. Your experience is important, and we'll certainly take it into account. But John could see the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe him. To them, he was just another lost hiker who'd had a bad fall and let his imagination run wild. After a few more questions, the officials left, promising to follow up if they needed any more information. As the door closed behind them, John turned to Sarah, his expression pained. You believe me, don't you? He asked, hating the note of desperation in his voice. Sarah squeezed his hand. Of course I do, John. I know you. If you say you saw a bear, then you saw a bear. But even as she spoke, John could see a flicker of doubt in her eyes. He turned away, staring out the window at the distant mountains where his ordeal had taken place. The next few days passed in a blur of medical tests, pain medication, and visits from concerned friends and family. John's story spread quickly through the small town of Billings, and soon a local news reporter arrived, eager for an interview. Mr. Harper, the young woman said, setting up her camera at his bedside. Your story has captivated our viewers. Can you tell us about your encounter with the bear? John hesitated, glancing at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. He took a deep breath and began to recount his experience once more, emphasizing the importance of bear safety and proper preparation for wilderness hikes. I was lucky, he concluded, his voice stronger now. But it could have ended very differently. Everyone needs to respect the power of nature and be prepared for anything when they're out there. The reporter nodded, scribbling notes. And what would you say to those who are skeptical about your bear encounter? John paused, choosing his words carefully. I know what I saw, he said finally. I've spent most of my life in these mountains. I know the difference between a bear and a figment of my imagination. But I understand their skepticism. Without proof, it's just my word. As the interview wrapped up, John could see in the reporter's eyes that this would be just another brief segment on the evening news. His life-changing encounter reduced to a few minutes of local color between weather and sports. Finally, after a week in the hospital, John was discharged. As Sarah helped him into the car, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. An angry red scar ran across his forehead, a permanent reminder of his brush with death. You okay? Sarah asked, noticing his pause. John nodded, tearing his eyes away from his reflection. Yeah, it's strange, you know? Everything's the same, but nothing feels the same. As they drove home, John was quiet, lost in thought. The familiar streets of Billings passed by outside, but he found himself scanning the tree line in the distance, half expecting to see a pair of dark, intelligent eyes watching him. At home, John was greeted by a flurry of concerned calls and visits. Friends and neighbors dropped by with casseroles and well wishes, eager to hear his story firsthand. John recounted his experience again and again, but with each telling, he could see the polite skepticism in their eyes. As the days passed, life began to return to normal for everyone but John. Sarah went back to work, the neighbors stopped dropping by, and the local news moved on to other stories. But for John, every rustle of leaves in the backyard, every shadow at dusk, brought him right back to those terrifying moments in the forest. One evening, as he sat on the back porch watching the sun set over the distant mountains, Sarah joined him, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. How are you doing, really? She asked softly. John was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the darkening sky. I don't know, he admitted finally. Sometimes I wonder if they're right. If maybe I did imagine it all. Sarah took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. John, look at me, she said. When he met her eyes, she continued, I know you. You're the most level-headed person I know. If you say you saw a bear, then you saw a bear. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself. John felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you," he whispered, squeezing her hand. As night fell, John and Sarah sat in comfortable silence, watching as the stars began to appear. And though the forest was miles away, John could still feel its presence, a mix of beauty and danger that would forever be a part of him. The bear might be gone, his wounds might heal, but the memory of those 2 days would stay with John Harper for the rest of his life. And as he sat there, surrounded by the peace of his backyard and the comfort of his wife's presence, John realized that perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing after all. Weeks had passed since John Harper's harrowing encounter in Glacier National Park. The physical wounds were healing. The angry red scar on his forehead had faded to a pale line, and his broken rib no longer sent sharp pains through his side with every breath. But the mental scars, the ones invisible to the eye, remained as fresh as ever. On a crisp autumn morning, John found himself standing at the trailhead of a familiar hiking path near Billings. It was a trail he'd walked countless times before, a gentle route that wound through golden aspen groves and offered stunning views of the distant mountains. But today, it looked different. Menacing almost. John's heart raced as he took the first step onto the packed dirt path. His hand instinctively reached for the bear spray canister on his belt, a new addition to his hiking gear that he now refused to leave home without. "You can do this, John," he muttered to himself, his voice shaky but determined. "It's just a walk in the woods. You've done this 1,000 times." But as he ventured deeper into the forest, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. A squirrel darting across the path made him jump, his hand flying to the bear spray. "Get a grip," John chastised himself, forcing his hand away from the canister. "It's just a squirrel, for crying out loud." He pressed on, trying to focus on the beauty around him, the vibrant fall colors, the crisp air, the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. But his eyes kept darting from tree to tree, scanning for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. About a mile into the hike, John paused to catch his breath. He leaned against a large boulder, closing his eyes and taking deep breaths to calm his racing heart. When he opened them again, he found himself staring directly into a dark crevice between 2 rocks. For a moment, his mind played a cruel trick on him. The shadows seemed to move, to take the shape of a massive bear, its eyes glinting in the darkness. John stumbled backward, a cry of fear escaping his lips. "No, no, no," he gasped, fumbling for the bear spray. But as he blinked, the illusion shattered. There was no bear, just shadows and his own overactive imagination. John slumped to the ground, his legs suddenly weak. He put his head in his hands, frustration and embarrassment washing over him. "What's happened to me?" he wondered aloud. "I used to love this. Now I can barely walk a mile without panicking." After a few minutes, John forced himself to stand. He knew he had a choice to make: turn back now and let the fear win, or push on and reclaim a piece of himself. With a deep breath, John continued down the trail. Every step was a battle against his instincts, which screamed at him to run, to seek safety. But he pressed on, determined to complete the hike. As he rounded a bend in the trail, John froze. There, not 20 feet ahead, was a large black shape. His heart leapt into his throat, memories of the attack flooding back in vivid detail. But then the shape moved, and John realized with a mixture of relief and embarrassment that it was just a black cow, part of a small herd grazing in a meadow beside the trail. "Hey there," John called out, his voice trembling slightly. The cow looked up, regarded him with mild curiosity, then went back to grazing. John let out a shaky laugh, the tension draining from his body. "Some scary bear you are," he said to the cow, which ignored him completely. As he continued his hike, John found himself jumping at shadows and imagining threats behind every boulder. He kept his hand close to the bear spray, his eyes constantly scanning the trees. Finally, John reached the summit of the trail. Under normal circumstances, he would have paused here to enjoy the panoramic view of the valley below. But today, he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, unable to relax even for a moment. As he began his descent, John's thoughts turned to the bear that had attacked him. Had it really been as massive as he remembered? Were its eyes truly as intelligent and menacing as they appeared in his nightmares? Or had his mind, in the grip of terror and exhaustion, exaggerated the encounter. Lost in these thoughts, John almost missed the movement in his peripheral vision. He turned sharply, his hand flying to the bear spray. There, just off the trail, was a young deer. It regarded John with wide, startled eyes before bounding away into the underbrush. John let out a long, slow breath. "Okay, Harper," he said to himself. "You've got to get it together. Not everything in these woods is out to get you." As he neared the end of the trail, John realized that while the hike had been challenging in ways he hadn't anticipated, he had made it. He had faced his fears and come out the other side. Back at the trailhead, John paused to look back at the forest. It still held an element of danger, a wildness that couldn't be tamed. But it was also beautiful, vital, and an essential part of the world he loved. "I'll be back," John promised, both to himself and to the wilderness. "And next time, I'll be stronger." That evening, as John sat on his back porch watching the sun set over the distant mountains, Sarah joined him with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "So, how was the hike?" she asked, handing him a mug. John was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "It was tough," he admitted finally. "Tougher than I expected. But I did it." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you, John. I know how hard that must have been." John nodded, his eyes fixed on the darkening sky. "You know, when I was out there today, I kept thinking about that bear. About how sure I was of what I saw even though no one else believes me. And?" Sarah prompted gently. "And I realized something," John continued. "It doesn't matter if anyone else believes me. I know what happened out there. That experience, as terrifying as it was, is part of me now. And maybe that's not such a bad thing." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. "How do you figure?" John took a sip of his coffee before answering. "It's made me more aware, more appreciative of the power of nature. And it's shown me how strong I can be when I need to be." He paused, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Plus, it's given me one hell of a story to tell the grandkids someday." Sarah chuckled. "Just promise me you won't scare them too much with your bear tales, old man." As night fell and the stars began to appear, John and Sarah sat in comfortable silence. The forest was out there, wild and unpredictable, but John no longer felt overwhelmed by fear. Instead, he felt a complex mix of respect, awe, and cautious appreciation for the wilderness. The bear spray unused at his side, John realized that while the fear might always be with him to some degree, it didn't have to control him. He could acknowledge it, respect it, and still find joy in the natural world he loved. As he gazed at the stars, John Harper made a silent promise to himself. He would keep hiking, keep exploring, and keep sharing his story. Because in the end, it wasn't just about surviving a bear attack. It was about learning to live with the memory, to grow from it, and to find strength in the face of fear. And that, John realized, was the greatest adventure of all.